And see, I see that as an advantage in being independent, is that we actually get to control who enters into Alberta. Because I think the reason why so many people from Ontario and BC are moving here, like you said, are economic. They're not ideological. And Alberta is very different in its what you refer to as difference in taste, and that's culture. And we are more entrepreneurial. We're more risk taking. And I think a lot of the people who come here from other provinces come here with different value systems and different ideologies that align more with the East than necessarily the West. So I think having more control over immigration would actually benefit protecting that culture of entrepreneurial kind of spirit and risk taking and innovation that is so different from the East. So I see that more as an advantage than a disadvantage. And yeah, there's a little more cost to doing that. But as you've pointed out, setting up an immigration process where there's borders is not something that can't be overcome. And with interprovincial trade, I love it when people tell me we're landlocked, because I always point out Canada's largest port happens to reside in Vancouver. And if Vancouver wants to get those goods, that come from all around the world, from, the West Coast to the East Coast, well, there's this large landmass called Alberta. We would then control the skies as well as our land mass. So, Vancouver, BC would have one of two options: either negotiate with Alberta, or they would have to, go down south and around Alberta. So, I think we would be in a very good position there to negotiate agreements. And I think our southern border, we've always had, I think, a closer in Alberta relationship with our US southern border friends than we have with the East. Because I think so many families, when they originally moved here, so many of them resided in both America and in Alberta. And we do our trade, and just being oil, like, I think we're more tied to the US dollar than we are to the Canadian dollar from a currency perspective, for example. So, when it comes to trade and currencies, those sort of pragmatic problems with independence, I think those are very overcome. We can overcome those quite easily. And I think we would have a lot of support from our US border, in the United States with that. What are your sort of thoughts, just to finish that kind of trade and currency, objections that people have and concerns?
Well, I'm not concerned as much about currency issues and some of these things. Just going back in terms of what I said earlier on about certain states breaking up in the past. In fact, you mentioned Ted Morton, but Ted Morton and Tom Flanagan and we wrote this book on the future of Alberta. We had a number of papers that were written for that, and we wrote a couple of pieces on that. But one of the pieces that I wrote actually was this international experience of conflict, and where you did have breakups and what happened. And in some cases, it didn't go too well, partly because a country really that ended up isolating itself ended up doing poorly as a result, and that happened particularly in Yugoslavia when there was a breakup of countries there. Now, many years later, some of them are doing fine, but the main point is that it took a number of years to overcome what happened with the breakup, but it was a breakup that really couldn't be avoided. And there are situations like that. Singapore has done perfectly well since it broke off from Malaysia, and we've seen some other examples of that. So yes, it's not the end of the world. Things can get eventually repaired. I think the main point I was really trying to say about mobility of labor, and I know I emphasized it, but it also means that we all have our relatives and friends that are sitting across the country, and we are part of and we do have. It's pretty easy to go from one place to another. I know when I go down to the United States, yes, I got to go through border control, but it's not much fun. It's extra work. I don't look at it in the same way as trying to go to Ontario or trying to go to Alberta or another province in this country. It's pretty, because we're all part of one jurisdiction. So I think I wouldn't diminish the fact that we all have friends and neighbors and relatives in other different parts of the country, and those are ties that are important. And one doesn't want to make it harder to get from one part to the other. And I think that's something which is a decision Albertans have to make, obviously, about whether they want to give that up if they decide to separate. But I wouldn't minimize the fact that can be quite important.
I think, again, if you take a look at European Union, for example, and the ease of traveling, I mean, different countries with different passports, but, again, I think that's a negotiation. And to your point earlier, with respect to whether we want the status quo or a 51st state or independence or more autonomy, I think, in my opinion, all of that is dependent at this stage, unless you just want the status quo, is a referendum where we get 51% of the vote that says yes. Because otherwise, I don't think we have any political leverage. Ontario can just completely do what it's always done, and that's ignore the grievances in the West. So, let's take a look at, I mean, Ottawa, for example, in public policy.